What does it mean if Jupiter's in Sagittarius? Well, if you really want to grasp that intuitively, and if you want to get the essence of what it means, first you should know what Jupiter signifies, and you should also know what Sagittarius is all about. Then you can get a good, clear understanding of how they mix. So that's what we'll do. In this video, we'll talk about Jupiter and Sagittarius separately, and then we'll talk about what happens when they combine, and then finally we'll look at people, well-known people who have Jupiter and Sagittarius, and we'll take a particularly close look today at 4 of them: Hermann Hesse, Richard Ramirez, Vincent van Gogh, and Woody Allen. So to begin with, what does Jupiter signify? Jupiter basically is all about positivity. Positivity basically means plus, which means increasing things. So Jupiter signifies growth and success. Because it signifies growth, it signifies growing, which means producing things, creating things. So it's productive. And because it means growing and producing things, it means having children. So Jupiter signifies parenting and all the parental figures in our life. Literally our parents, but also people like teachers, role models, guides, gurus, priests, coaches, mentors, etc. Because Jupiter is plusy and productive, it signifies surplus, which means it has the ability to be charitable. Another sense of the word positivity is the idea of optimism. And Jupiter signifies that optimism, and that's why Jupiter signifies things that you believe in, things that you are optimistic about. That means you don't necessarily have full proof that they're true, but you trust them. So that's Jupiter's connection. One of the ways Jupiter's connected with religion, faith, belief, trust, and hence it's connected with honesty, trustability, or morals. And the bottom line of all this is that Jupiter is all about wisdom. In other words, philosophy or ethics or religion. Now let's talk about Sagittarius. The root of everything Sagittarius is about can be summarized as ideological ambition. Because you're taking Jupiter, which is ideological, and you're giving it a fire sign, which is ambitious. The most simple thing to derive from the concept of ideological ambition is the concept of philosophy. Sagittarius is quite inclined to philosophy. And phrased differently, that also means ethics or law. And then, because it's got ideological ambition, it likes to deal with education. Because it's dual, it actually likes to take both sides of the educational process. It likes to teach as well as learn. But on this side of the coin, where Sagittarius has to do with teaching, because it's a fiery teaching sign, it means that Sagittarius has to do with leaders. And so Sagittarius is actually a governmentally oriented zodiac sign, but kind of from the intellectual or ideological angle on government. Also, because Jupiter has to do with words, often you'll see that people will do their leadership via speaking or writing. They'll do their leadership via words. On the other side of the coin, Sagittarius is about learning. And so it makes Sagittarius have a very curious nature. It has a lot of curiosity. So we can describe it as being broad-minded, interested in new ideas. So now that we know everything we should know or need to know about Jupiter and Sagittarius, we can talk intelligently and profitably about the significations of Jupiter being in Sagittarius. So Jupiter is the planet of philosophy, and Sagittarius is also the sign for philosophy. So putting the planet of philosophy in the sign of philosophy, you get this synergy on this topic of philosophy, and it goes well. Jupiter in Sagittarius therefore signifies philosophical people, ideological people, teacher-oriented people. So classics have this phrase, he will be addressing the assembly, meaning like he'll be lecturing to the class, or he'll be speaking on the podium. Another thing is that Jupiter is the planet of parenting, And Sagittarius is a sign which is very favorable to leadership. Parenting is a type of leadership or guidance. So you have guiding and guiding. Sagittarius, the sign of guiding. Jupiter, the planet of guiding. So the effect of having Jupiter in Sagittarius is you're likely to be a guide, but particularly in Jupiterian, Sagittarian ways. So you're likely to be a legal guide or a lawyer or a political guide, a politician, or just a plain advisor in some capacity, or a director of things. You could even be an entertainment director. And the final thing to bear in mind when considering Jupiter in Sagittarius is that it's opulent, or it's plusy. And the reason for that is that Jupiter is a giving planet or a plusy planet, and Sagittarius is a giving sign or a plusy sign. So this is the reason why Jupiter in Sagittarius is associated with being successful or wealthy. Now that we have a pretty good theoretical grasp of what Jupiter in Sagittarius should signify, we should now take a practical approach and look at people who have Jupiter in Sagittarius. We would expect to see quite a few philosophers because Jupiter is the planet of philosophy and Sagittarius is the sign of philosophy. So Jupiter in Sagittarius is supposed to signify philosophers or teachery type. In fact, we do see very significant philosophers had Jupiter in Sagittarius. So Copernicus, Thoreau, Hermann Hesse, Eckhart Tolle, Tony Robbins, Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, George Gurdjieff, I think that's the pronunciation, and Friedrich Hegel. We also said that Jupiter in Sagittarius indicates a leadership. And in fact, we do find many, many politicians with Jupiter in Sagittarius. Here's a list of some of them that I collected. George H.W. Bush, Jimmy Carter, Hillary Clinton, John McCain, and Al Gore. Those are the Americans. Justin Trudeau, Silvio Berlusconi, some Europeans, prime ministers. Karunanidhi, an important Indian political figure who's also an idealist and writer. Maximilien Robespierre, French Revolution ideologist. Ayatollah Khomeini, religious leader, philosophical leader. Kim Jong-un, an atheistic religious leader. Heinrich Himmler, the Nazi who killed 1 billion and million zillion people. Ideologically. Another interesting thing with Jupiter and Sagittarius is you find a lot of significant writers have this. That's also related to the same dynamic that's creating politicians, really. It's that Jupiter and Sagittarius indicates a leadery type of a person, but they lead through direction and they lead through words. So it is sensible that we would find some significant writers. Particularly, I noted Hans Christian Andersen, I'm not sure of all these pronunciations, the kind of children's fairy tale story maker. Woody Allen, who's both a writer and a director. Truman Capote, a non-fiction writer. Sacha Baron Cohen, a.k.a. Borat, who is actually a political commentator. And William Blake. You also find artists, which is interesting. Why does Sagittarian Jupiter show up in the chart of artists? I will mention a few of these names so you see the kind of caliber of artists we're talking about. Van Gogh, Jackson Pollock, Renoir, Goya, Toulouse-Lautrec. So we're talking about high caliber artists. What about Jupiter and Sagittarius was showing that? Maybe it's not about Jupiter and Sagittarius that made these particular people an artist. Maybe it's something else in their chart. So I'm going to flag Vincent van Gogh as somebody that we want to look at on the next page. Finally, I also want to mention, besides Heinrich Himmler, you also have a criminal, Richard Ramirez. So both of these guys are almost religious or ideological killers. So you can see how Jupiter and Sagittarius is giving that ideology, but it's interesting how it gets twisted in their charts. So let's look at Ramirez's chart also in more detail. So I want to look at 4 of these people in more detail to understand how the charts are actually working with Jupiter and Sagittarius. I want to do Richard Ramirez, Van Gogh, Woody Allen, and Hermann Hesse. I feel that Hermann Hesse represents a very straight, archetypical Jupiter and Sagittarius, a philosophical guide who writes a lot of books and leads through words. And then I think on the other side of the coin you have Richard Ramirez. He's not a nice guy, and Jupiter in Sagittarius has nothing about it, which is supposed to be mean. So how does that work out? And then I also want to see why we have writers and artists with Jupiter and Sagittarius. So let's also look at Woody Allen and Vincent van Gogh. First, let's figure out these writers. Woody Allen and Vincent van Gogh. If you look at Woody Allen, well, he has a Virgo ascendant. So that's going to incline him to be more word-oriented. His first lord, Mercury, is extremely conjoined to this Jupiter in Sagittarius. So that's putting a huge influence of mercurial, Virgo-ish symbolism, injecting that into this Jupiter in Sagittarius. Especially for a writer, you would see the third lord be prominent, because third house has to do with hands and writing. So in fact, his third lord is Mars, which is exalted in his 5th house, which is the house for creativity. So it's everything besides Jupiter and Sagittarius is very inclined to writing, and that's why Jupiter and Sagittarius, in his case, lends itself to writing, instead of him becoming a presidential candidate. By the way, I mentioned satirical or kind of sardonic or dry. That's my impression of all of Woody Allen's work. So I expected maybe a Saturn rising sign or a Saturn moon or something. He does have a Saturn moon and a 6th house Saturn moon, and that does help explain it. Besides the fact that Saturn is lording his moon, Saturn is extremely dominant on his ascendant as well as on his Jupiter and Mercury. So that does explain his character. So the important thing to take away here is don't just look at the person and then cut and paste everything about that person onto their planetary placement. So for example, don't just say Jupiter Sagittarius, Woody Allen has it. Woody Allen is X, Y, and Z, therefore Jupiter in Sagittarius signifies X, Y, and Z. You'll get crazy results like that, crazily bad. Because, for example, Woody Allen's sense of irony and satire and kind of critique of society doesn't come from his Jupiter in Sagittarius, it comes from his Saturn. So you need to look at these charts. You need to be able to do it theoretically. A lot of people say, don't do astrology theoretically, do it practically, look at real charts. That's ridiculous. You have to get your theory first. That's like saying, don't learn how to play a musical instrument, just go and join the symphony. That's crazy. You need to learn the basics of how to play your instrument, and then you can go participate in a performance. So you do need to know the theory of what should Jupiter and Sagittarius be all about. So when you see something outside of the theory, it gives you a flag. I should look at this chart to see what else is going on here. Maybe it is something about Jupiter and Sagittarius that I didn't consider before, but probably it's something else. So let's also look at Vincent van Gogh. He has a phenomenal Venus. He has exalted Venus in the 9th house in the Raja Yoga. And this is a Raja Yoga involving Venus, the 11th Lord, and Mars, the 5th Lord. So it's a 5th and 11th Lord combination, which is fantastically artistic. And Raja Yoga, which is very powerful in the 9th house with an exalted planet. That explains why he's an artist. Again, you would look at the 3rd house to see somebody that's using their hands effectively. So his 3rd Lord, Mercury, is on the 10th house cusp. So that signifies that his 3rd Lord is very dominant or prominent. By the way, other things about his nature, he's quirky too. You might expect Saturn to have a huge influence in his chart as well as Woody Allen's. And in fact, it does, because it has a huge aspect on the ascendant. But the other thing I want you to consider with Van Gogh, to understand the things about him that are not really Jupiterian Sagittarius. So he has first Lord Moon in the 6th house with Ketu with Jupiter. So you're not getting the typically optimistic nature of Jupiter in Sagittarius. Okay, that's Woody Allen and Vincent van Gogh. I also want to take a look at Hermann Hesse compared to Richard Ramirez, because here you have people that are kind of on opposite sides of the coin. Hermann Hesse being somebody that you would say, yeah, put this guy in the dictionary as an example of Jupiter and Sagittarius. Richard Ramirez, you would say, I don't know, should we mention that this guy has Jupiter and Sagittarius? Because Jupiter and Sagittarius is not supposed to be evil, and this guy, that's his main thing, is that he's evil. So what's the difference between these two charts? Actually, these two charts, as you could see, are astonishingly similar. There are a few differences, but the most significant of the differences is Mercury. In Hermann Hesse's chart, he has domicile Mercury. That's extremely influential on Jupiter and the ascendant. Can you see that? You see his Mercury is in Gemini, right opposite from Jupiter and the ascendant. So that means here's a person with Jupiter in Sagittarius, highly influenced by a very positive Mercury. And that's why Hermann Hesse is a philosopher and a writer. In Richard Ramirez's chart, Mercury is not domicile, it's debilitated. Not only is it debilitated, it's extremely conjoined to Ketu, which, as you probably know, Ketu is extremely unsteady and strange. And it is not particularly influential on his Jupiter, nor does his Jupiter have a particularly strong influence on it, but it is very strongly influencing his moon. Mercury influencing the moon is potentially insanity, especially if Mercury is debilitated and with Ketu and in the 4th house. So the real difference between these two charts is how Mercury is doing. Both of them have Jupiter and Sagittarius in the 1st house near the ascendant. So both of these people are ideologically driven. But Richard Ramirez is insane, whereas Hermann Hesse is quite intelligent. And that's reflected by the fact that Hermann Hesse has a very strong Mercury, giving very strong influence, positive influence to his Jupiter and ascendant, whereas Richard Ramirez has a very, very, very troubled Mercury, having a strong influence on the moon. One other little FYI about the one slight difference in the Jupiters themselves in this chart. They are slightly at a different degree. In fact, Richard Ramirez's Jupiter is barely clinging to the edge of Sagittarius, whereas Hermann Hesse is late in Sagittarius, but still before the Sunday, or the border. It's at 27 degrees for Hermann Hesse. Richard Ramirez is at basically 30 degrees, which is literally the border. So that's another factor. Jupiter in Sagittarius on the border is not really going to be able to be very influential, even if it is in the 1st house near the ascendant. So Richard Ramirez, even though the charts look similar, is much more characterized by debilitated Ketu conjoined Mercury moon, and not so much characterized by Jupiter and Sagittarius, whereas Hermann Hesse is very characterized by Jupiter and Sagittarius with the influence of Mercury, positive Mercury. So I hope you enjoyed all that interesting info about Jupiter and Sagittarius. Now, hopefully, you're able to really understand Jupiter and Sagittarius well. Don't forget, I have videos already made about all the planets and all the signs up till this one, starting from Sun and Aries. And subscribe and hit the bell for notifications so that you know about the next one, which comes out, Jupiter and Capricorn, which should be next week. If you want to get this kind of information tailored to you and your chart, and all your planets and your signs and houses and nakshatras, etc., go to my website. The link is on the screen over there and in the description below. It's victorcara.com. Go over to the report section and order the report called Guided Tour to Your Birth Chart. It will give you all of this kind of information tailored specifically to you.